Picture this. You're 58. You've put money into your retirement account every single month for 30 years. You pull up the balance one morning, coffee in hand, feeling good about where you stand. And then the market drops 11% in 6 weeks. Gone. Not because you did anything wrong. Not because you panicked and sold something you shouldn't have. It just happened, because that's what markets do sometimes. And now you're doing quiet math in your head about whether you can still retire in 2 years like you planned, or whether the market just handed you another 5 years at a job you were already counting down from. That moment right there, that gut punch moment, is one a huge number of people hit right before retirement. And it's exactly what we're unpacking today. I'm Liam, and I spend an unreasonable amount of time thinking about money, retirement psychology, and why some people glide into their 60s feeling steady, while other people who did everything technically right still feel like the ground could shift under them at any moment. A lot of that difference comes down to one boring, often dismissed part of a portfolio that most people either misunderstand or write off as something for overly cautious retirees. I'm talking about bonds. I know, bonds don't exactly get anyone's pulse up. Nobody's building a following around their bond ladder. But the boring stuff is very often the stuff that quietly saves you. Insurance is boring. Emergency funds are boring. And bonds, in a real sense, are the financial equivalent of flossing, easy to skip, and something you will deeply regret ignoring the moment things go wrong. So today we're walking through why bonds can genuinely be the thing that saves a retirement. Not by making anyone rich, that was never their job, but by making sure the wealth someone already built actually survives long enough and steadily enough to support them. We'll cover what bonds actually do inside a portfolio that stocks can't, why the timing of a downturn matters more than most people realize, the psychological side nobody talks about enough, and what a sensible bond allocation actually looks like in practice. Let's start with what bonds are actually for. Not the textbook version. You lend money to a government or a company, they pay you interest, you get your principal back at maturity. You already know that, or you can look it up in 10 seconds. What matters more is the job bonds are doing inside a portfolio, and that job is almost never make me rich. Think of a portfolio like a road trip. Stocks are the engine. They provide the horsepower, the growth that turns years of contributions into an actual retirement fund. But bonds are the brakes and the seatbelt. Nobody buckles up because they're excited about it. Nobody thinks about their brakes on a calm, sunny highway. But the first time something jumps out in front of the car, that person is going to be very grateful the brakes are there. Bonds aren't there to win the race. They're there so the wealth someone built doesn't get totaled right before they need it. Here's a story that makes this concrete. Picture a retired couple. Call them Benjamin and Victoria. They retired in exactly the wrong year. They'd done everything the personal finance world tells people to do. Maxed out retirement accounts, kept fees low, saved with real discipline for decades. Then the market took a sudden, brutal hit right as they started pulling income from their portfolio. Here's the important part. The people who made it through that stretch with their retirement intact weren't necessarily the ones with the most money. They were the ones who had a meaningful chunk sitting in bonds. Boring, steady, untouched by the crash, that they could draw income from, instead of being forced to sell stocks at rock-bottom prices. Same crash, completely different outcomes, because of one structural decision made years earlier. That's not luck. That's not market timing. That's just having breaks. So the takeaway here is simple. Bonds aren't there to make a retirement bigger. They're there to make sure it survives. If someone is within 10 years of retiring, or already retired, the honest question worth asking is this. If the market dropped 25% tomorrow and stayed down for 2 years, what would actually fund the next 2 years of life? If the honest answer is, sell stocks at a loss, that's a real problem, and bonds are usually the fix. Now let's talk about something that trips almost everyone up. Sequence of returns risk. It sounds far more intimidating than it actually is. While someone is young and still adding money to a portfolio every month, the order in which good years and bad years show up doesn't matter much. A crash early in a career is actually great. It means buying stocks on sale for years afterward while still contributing. A crash near the end of a 40-year career is also fine, because there are still years to recover before the money is needed. Retirement flips that entirely. Now money is coming out instead of going in. If a downturn hits in the first 5 years of retirement, right when someone is withdrawing income instead of adding to it, the math turns genuinely brutal. Shares get sold at depressed prices to fund everyday life, which locks in losses and permanently shrinks the pool of money that has to last the rest of that person's life. Two retirees can have the exact same average return over 30 years, and one runs out of money while the other leaves millions behind, purely because of when the bad years happened relative to when withdrawals started. Nobody gets to choose when the market decides to have a rough stretch. But, and this is the part that actually matters, everyone gets to choose how exposed they are to that risk in the first place. This is where bonds stop being a nice-to-have and become an actual retirement saving tool. With 3 to 5 years of living expenses parked in bonds or bond-like assets going into retirement, a crash in year one doesn't force anyone to sell stocks at the bottom. Income comes from the bond bucket instead, while the stock portion sits, recovers, and life goes on relatively undisturbed. This single decision matters far more the closer someone gets to retirement, and far less at 25. It was never really about age. It's about proximity to the withdrawal phase, how close someone is to needing that money for actual rent and actual groceries. Now let's talk about the psychological piece, because it might matter as much as the math, maybe more. A portfolio that's entirely stocks isn't just risky on a spreadsheet. It's risky in a how do you sleep at night sense. And bad sleep leads to bad decisions. When markets crash and someone's entire net worth is riding on stocks, panic isn't hypothetical. It's basically the default human response. A steep portfolio drop looks a lot like danger, and people are wired to run from danger. So people sell at the bottom. Every cycle, some percentage of otherwise smart, disciplined people convince themselves this crash is different, that getting out now and back in later is the smart move. They almost never time it right. They lock in the loss and miss the recovery. Here's the part about bonds that doesn't get said enough. A meaningful bond allocation isn't just a math strategy. It's an emotional stabilizer. When part of a portfolio is barely moving while the stock side is falling, it gives a person something steady to hold on to. It's the difference between watching a boat take on water with no lifeboat in sight and knowing there's a calm life raft bobbing right next to it, even if it's never actually needed. People with bonds in their portfolio are measurably less likely to panic sell during downturns, and that alone can be worth more to long-term wealth than any small difference in average annual return. It's easy to look down on bonds early on. Why hold something that barely grows when stocks have historically returned so much more over time? That logic isn't wrong for someone in their 20s with decades of runway. But watching enough real retirements play out tends to shift that view. The boring choice is often the wise choice, precisely because it accounts for how people actually behave under stress, not how they'd behave if they were emotionless calculators. So here's the practical version. If the thought of a market crash makes someone's stomach turn, that discomfort is useful information about their real risk tolerance, not their theoretical one. Shifting part of a portfolio into bonds isn't giving up on growth. It's buying the emotional stability to actually stick with a plan, instead of blowing it up in a panic at the worst possible moment. So how does someone actually think about how much to put into bonds? There's an old rule of thumb that's circulated in personal finance for decades. Hold your age in bonds. 30 years old, 10% bonds. 60 years old, 60% bonds. Simple, memorable, and honestly a bit too conservative for a lot of people today, given how much longer money now needs to stretch. Many modern planners lean toward age minus 20 instead, which allows more growth exposure for a longer retirement horizon. But rigid formulas like these ignore the details that actually matter. How much guaranteed income comes from something like a pension, how flexible someone's spending really is, and how they personally react to seeing red numbers on a screen. Someone with a solid pension, covering most basic expenses, can afford to be more aggressive with the rest of their portfolio because their bond-like income is already covered elsewhere. Someone relying entirely on their portfolio for income needs a sturdier bond foundation because there's no other safety net underneath them. A more useful framework is thinking in years of expenses rather than a flat percentage. Add up essential annual expenses, the costs that have to be covered no matter what the market is doing, and aim to have somewhere between 3 and 7 years of that covered in bonds or similarly stable assets heading into and through retirement. That reframes the whole question from what percentage should I own to how many years of peace of mind do I actually have, which is a far more human way to think about it. None of this makes bonds risk-free. They carry interest rate risk. Prices can fall when rates rise, and longer-term bonds feel that more than shorter-term ones. Inflation can quietly erode the purchasing power of bond income too. Bonds aren't a magic safety blanket with zero downside. They're a tool, and like any tool, they need to be understood for what they're good at and what they're not. Quickly, on the different flavors of bonds, because lumping them all together is a bit like saying food without specifying a salad or a deep-fried snack. Treasury bonds, issued by the government, are about as safe as it gets, but they pay less because of that safety. Corporate bonds pay more but carry more risk depending on the issuing company's financial health. Municipal bonds can offer tax advantages depending on where someone lives. And bond funds, or ETFs, bundle a wide range of individual bonds together, so nobody has to build a bond ladder rung by rung on their own. For most people, a low-cost bond index fund, or a target date fund that automatically rebalances, does the vast majority of the job without requiring a finance degree. Let's bring it together. Retirement isn't just a math problem. It's the result of decades of decisions and sacrifices, resting on the trust that if the work got done and the smart choices got made, the system would hold up when it mattered. Nothing tests that trust like watching a retirement account drop right when it can least be afforded. 4 things worth carrying away from this. First, bonds aren't there to make anyone rich. They're there to make sure the wealth already built actually lasts. Second, pay attention to sequence of returns risk, especially within a decade of retiring, because the timing of bad years matters more than most people realize. Third, take the psychological piece seriously. The ability to stick with a plan during a crash is worth as much as the allocation on paper. And finally, think in years of expenses covered rather than a rigid formula, because every situation is different. If there's one thing worth doing after watching this, it's simply looking at an actual portfolio. Not to panic, not to overhaul everything overnight, just to honestly ask, if the market fell apart tomorrow, is there a plan or is it just hope? Hope isn't a strategy. A well-thought-out bond allocation is. Give the future version of that effort the brakes and the seatbelt, not just the engine. Because the goal was never just a big number. It was a life secure enough to actually enjoy. If this was useful, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more of